E tau nei ki rungi a tātou katoa, te wairoa o ngā mātua tupuna, nā rātou I whakatakoto te ara hei hikoitanga mā tātou ngā uri. I whakatōki o tātou ngā kau ki ngā tikanga, hei ara takingia I a tātou. Kia ngā kau nui ki te hāpai I a tātou mahi katoa, I roto I te pono, I te tika, I te māramatanga, me te aroha nō tētehi ki tētehi. Koia rā I rongo, o ke ire ake ki runga. Tuturo uti waka maua kia tīna, tīna, haumi e, hui e, tāiki e. He karanga tēnei kia koutou, he are taringa mai ana, he karanga tēnei no raro I te maunga o Taranaki. Nā tūtama wahine o Taranaki te karanga nei, kia tātou, nau mai, whakatau mai rā. Whakatau mai ki runga I tēnei kaupapa whakahirahira. Tēnei kaupapa kia whakatairanga ake a tātou tamariki mokopuna mō ngā tau kei te heke mai. He uri tēnei I roto I a Taranaki, I roto I a Ngāruehine, Taranaki iwi, tānga hoe, te pakakoi, te atiawa. Whakawhiti atu ki Ngātirangi Wewei ki a tainui anō oki, ki ngā mautere o Hāmoa. Ko Hinerangi Edwards tōku ingoa. It is my pleasure, E Hoa Ma, to be your facilitator and convener of our sessions today. This morning, we were very privileged to listen to Linda Tuhiwai-Smith to talk about the context of the research that has been shared with us over today and the next 2 Fridays around violence and kaupapa approaches towards addressing violence and its prevalence in our society. She contextualised violence upon Māori and Indigenous people in our first session this morning. This afternoon, we heard from Professor Leonie Pihama about defining Māori family violence for Māori, intersectionality and violence. This topic today, this afternoon, we will conclude with Dr. Cherryl Smith, and Cherryl will be talking about historical and intergenerational trauma, a genealogy of violence. He kaupapa nui tēnei, ki eti I o tātou e wakarongo mai nei, he taumaha ki roto, engari he oranga anō, he rongo ā, te rongo I ēnei kōrero ka whakapuaki I ēnei māreikura. So, E Hoa Ma, for those of you who are listening, we just want to acknowledge that we carry and we experience this kōrero in different ways, and we support you, the survivors, the healers, the fighters, the resistors, the liberators amongst us, and many whānau that have had at various stages experienced violence on a daily basis, and also experience the stages of recovery and the development through the healing of these violences. Some of the information that we share throughout the series may surface some responses or memories in you, which is normal. If you feel the need to pause, to have a moment of self-care, me mahi pera ka tika. This session will be recorded for use and viewing at a later stage. If you need to kōrero with other people about your own experiences, following on from the kōrero in these webinars, here are some whānau who might be able to support. One is Mauri Oho. It's a kaupapa Māori website for sexual violence resources. Are You OK? Which has contact details, website Are You OK? www.ruok.org.nz, which has details of support services in Aotearoa. Family Violence Info Centre, phone number is 0800 456 450. And having listened to the last 2 webinars, I think every website that talks about tino rangatiratanga and self-determination are probably websites that have rongoa for us to support and galvanise ourselves at this time. The session will be hosted in a webinar format, which means that you won't be able to see, our speaker will not be able to see you in the audience per se online, but they will be able to receive your questions using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar. It says Q&A. So if you write into the Q&A, unclick the tick box for your name to be shared, or keep it ticked, and it will be an anonymous question from you. Our session will run for about 15 minutes. So Dr. Cherryl Smith will be able to kōrero for her for 50 minutes or so, and then we will have half an hour of questions and answers. We will get to as many of the questions that you share as we can. You also have the opportunity to use closed captions at your end of your computer. So we'll share in the chat a link for you to jump on so that you can figure out how to put closed captions on your computer. Some of our speakers have said when they have closed captions, it's difficult for them not to read, and gets hoha when the reo Māori gets massacred. Just saying. So please, if you would like to use that functionality, Zoom enables you to do that at your end of the computer. There is a short survey that will come at the conclusion of the questions and answers. When you click off the survey, click off this webinar, it will come up on your screen, and it will only take a couple of minutes. We really appreciate if you were able to fill that survey out so that we can ensure that your viewing experience can be improved where we can. E hoa ma. Those are all of those key messages. Oh, actually, these kinds of events don't happen without the support of funders and other kaitautoko. So we just acknowledge those that you can see on your screen. Te ara tupu. I'll just make my screen a bit bigger. It's clearly telling me that I'm getting older and my reading isn't so good, my eyes aren't so good. So first and foremost, Tūtama Wahine o Taranaki are leading this mahi with the lead researcher, Dr. Leonie Pihama. We also have Te ara tupu, Pūranga Kura. Te whare wānanga o Awanui Ārangi, e mihi ana kia koutou. We also have Te Atawhai o Te Ao. We have Kakariki Consulting Limited, Te Whānau o Te Rau Aroha Limited, Lalanga Training and Consultancy. We have Te Puna Oranga, Māori and Indigenous Analysis Limited, and funding from Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Tēnā no koutou e hoa mā ngā kaitautoko i tēnei kaupapa. I believe at this stage we get to introduce our beautiful kai kōrero, and again, we're so fortunate, privileged to listen to this calibre of researcher, academic and wahine toa that we have experienced today. So Dr. Cherryl Wairea Iterangi Smith of Tūtama Wahine, and I believe a founder of Te Atawhai o Te Ao, no ngā wairiki, Ngāti Apa, Te Aitanga Hauiti, Ngāti Kahungunu, me Ngai Tau. Cherryl is a grandmother and researcher. She has over 25 years of Kaupapa Māori research experience and has led major research projects in the last 15 years on Māori intergenerational trauma and healing, whakatika, Māori experiences of racism. She works with her own iwi, managing the research unit. Te rangatira kai ki te au, i a koe i runga i tō tātou kiriata i tēnei rā, ka nui te mihi ki a koe, me ngā mahi huhua, ko oti i a koe, so many different kaupapa that you have carried and continue to carry, ka nui te mihi. I am going to give you your space and get off your screen. Tēnā no koe.
Tēnā koe. Hene rangi, mō tō karakia, mō tō mihi hoki. Tēnā rā koutou katoa ki a koutou e whakarongo ana ki a mātou ngā kairanga hau o he Waka Eke Noa. Tēnā koutou. Just one correction there. I just noticed that my name came up under Tūtama Wahine, but I'm based with Te Atawhai o Te Ao, which is an Indigenous Research Institute, Māori Indigenous Research Institute, that's based in Whanganui. So kia ora koutou. So my part of the presentation today, what I'm going to focus on is historical and intergenerational trauma, a genealogy of violence. And you will see that our bigger project, He Waka Eke Noa, actually focuses on Māori cultural frameworks for violence prevention and intervention. So it's a bigger kaupapa that we're actually looking at. But my part that I'm going to talk about today is about this particular area. So this section of the report focuses on historical, state and structural violence. And we're adding, our report's really adding to what's a wealth of research and information that's been provided to show, by other researchers actually, to show the inequities, disparities, gaps, the power imbalances, structural, institutional, colonial origins that make up the genealogy of violence. So we've gathered evidence from the layers of research from Māori and Indigenous researchers and from the interviews that we undertook. And of course, there's also the survey that's being run, which will be spoken about later. So this is a quote from our report. A deep analysis of historical and intergenerational trauma from a Māori perspective must be actively engaged in to understand the origins and reproduction of family violence within and upon whānau, hapu, iwi and Māori communities. And that's a fairly basic statement, which I know this has come up in the previous two presentations as well, which is there's a lot of work we have to do as whānau, hapu, particularly around what does our history, what do our histories actually look like? And we're piecing together those fragments that we have. And that's ongoing mahi. Part of that is also the uncovering of how colonisation really impacted us. And we're really only at, in some ways, we're really only at surface levels, at the surface level of uncovering those histories and stories. And we're doing that through places like the Waitangi Tribunal and through other places. But there's still a lot of work to be done in that area of talking about our hapu histories. And because there's so many layers to those histories and layers to the disposition through a flood of laws and policies. And we're also working to strengthen those knowledges. So after the signing of the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, we know that brute force and legislation were the colonisers' weapons of choice. And they were used to eradicate collective Māori identities. So I think, and I just really wanted to start by talking about the basics, and the basics around particularly hegemony and constant ideas that keep floating around, and they're the ideas that frame how Māori have become the problem. It becomes a Māori problem. Violence is considered a Māori problem. So the idea that it was okay for a man to beat his wife was introduced with colonisation. The idea that it was okay to beat children as a form of discipline was introduced with colonisation. The idea that white masculinity was a biologically superior state and was created from a male god was introduced with colonisation. The idea that Indigenous peoples, their ways of living, their knowledges were inferior and to be phased out was introduced with colonisation. And although some of us might understand these concepts, be very familiar with this, we are still having to decolonize from the ways in which these ideologies pervade so much of what's currently happening in the violence sector. One of the things that our kai kōrero, those that we interviewed, spoke about a lot was the breaking down of whānau. And this is a quote from one of them. I think one of the problems is the reconstruction of what it is to be whānau. And I think the escalation of whānau violence, to have your whole notion of what it is to be human and what it is to be whānau transplanted through systems that none of us could escape. The schooling system, for example, to actually pursue a system like Christianity or religion in the belief that it was going to give you a pathway to peacefulness, which is often what our tipuna were looking for, only to find that the trade-off is to be socialised in a whole range of norms that are foreign to you. For example, the kind of patriarchal mindset or the idea of women and children as chattels, or all of this kind of madness. And so when we spoke to kai kōrero, it was very common for them to be very clear about where violence stemmed from. Becoming dislocated, dispossessed, a lot of language, loss of our own self of who we are, all contributed to violence on varying levels. There's the state level violence, the community level, and then there's the personal individual level that occurs. They also spoke about how that translates into the everyday. Violence occurs when Māori are walking down the street. Violence occurs when Māori boys are walking up the street, and they are the ones pulled over by the police. Violence occurs when Pākehā colleagues at work looked at me surprised, when I have a really great articulate academic sentence come out of my mouth. Oh, this Māori is clever. It is still occurring. It still occurs. So all of the racism, all of the institutional racism, all of the personal racism. And we know a lot of these violences are not counted as violence. The report also goes into historical and intergenerational trauma, because both an analysis of colonisation and an analysis of historical and intergenerational trauma is really key for understanding how violence intersects and becomes part of our whānau. Historical and intergenerational trauma theory and analysis talks about the ways in which violence plays out both personally and collectively. And that it also acknowledges the deliberate and intentional nature of the violence upon specific groups of people. Historical trauma is also reproduced through colonising state mechanisms, and others have talked about this earlier today. Those mechanisms serve to maintain and sustain the exact systems of trauma and dispossession used throughout the colonising processes of the state. So the intergenerational nature of trauma can continue to pass in various ways through whānau and whakapapa lines. But this theory also looks at, it emphasises approaching whatever you do and drawing on the stories and the values of our own tūpuna. So it's not just a totalising discourse. When you enter the historical trauma theory and analysis has also looked at what helps us going forward. And so people like Karina Walters have talked about the importance of looking at our original instructions, looking at our whakapapa, our kōrero. It also looks at reconnecting people to the vibrant strengths of their ancestry and culture, helping people process the grief of the past, traumas, and creating new historical narratives can have healing effects for those experiencing historical trauma. And Karina's work also talked about working collectively, the importance of processes of working collectively to revive original instructions. We use different types of languaging, than original instructions, but the linkages there can be seen quite clearly. And also the importance of restoring is coming forward with, particularly with Michelle Johnson-Jennings' work, and the need to engage in resource Kaupapa Māori organisations is really critical in this work, that can intervene both at the individual level and at the level of collective histories and experiences. So when we're thinking about historical trauma events, a number of kōkōrero spoke about those. They spoke about, both the broad sweep impacts, the loss of language, the loss of land, but they also made reference to specific events. So here's one of those. I think that there are significant points in history where things change for Māori. Again, talking to my cousins the other day, and I know this in terms of having been involved in some of the stories around the Māori battalion and our men coming back from war. I see that as quite a critical space in time, where they'd gone away, many never came back, where women primarily took on multiple roles while they were away. When they came back, they were promised things by the Crown and never received those things, where they faced absolute trauma while they were away and could never really talk about that with their families. So that is one example when I think there was a significant shift in our communities, which brought about whānau violence, and generations later, we're still seeing the impacts of that. And of course, when we look at state agencies, we've talked for the previous speakers have spoken about the state in particular, we wind up with paternalistic state models. And this is how it was explained by one of our kōkōrero. It's now become that the state has empowered and resourced the agencies. So we've created now agencies doing work, whereas communities used to do that very work. But it's being prescribed that the agencies have now set up health and social service agencies that are now sidelined spectators, wondering, how do I get on the playing field of that community? They also spoke about how racism and stereotypes prevail in agencies. In the framework of politics and governments, whether it's in Labour or National or whoever, I think there are some very corrupt people out there. We have got institutional racism. We've got racism out there that's rampant. And how are we going to dispel the illusion of Māori men being violent? How do we do that? That can only come from the top. We all work hard to do that, but it has to come to the middle. We do our bit, they do their bit, but they're not even close to being there, I think. And that illusion of all Māori men are violent is just so incorrect. Leonie talked earlier around intersectionality, and I just wanted to touch on a bit on that. I agree, I don't like the term either, in terms of we have to develop our own language for talking about these different networks and ways that power imbalances are happening. But the historical development of the state was built on colonisation and its many forms of violence, and we do have to look at what those intersections are. We do have to look at the patriarchy, the ableism, the racism, the neoliberal economic, and many, many others. And I just pulled this quote out just as an example. Ableism looks like calling people inspiring, for navigating a system that is designed for exclusion while doing nothing to hold the system accountable. So within our communities, we know we have communities whose voices, we have communities within communities, and that's really important to be thinking about around as we go forward to thinking about this work, is how do we include everybody and not leave anybody out of our discussions around whānau and whakapapa. So oranga tamariki, of course, was spoken about a lot. I'm sure that when the presenters come on and talk about particularly the way our kaimahi are working in this sector, there will be much more said about oranga tamariki. But I wanted to actually pull out a couple of quotes that came from kaimahi who work in oranga tamariki. Even with this change happening with oranga tamariki, I must say, when I first went in, the pōuri, the mamae I felt when I'm reading cases of whānau, yes, they're having an argument, you know, the parents and all that, and I keep reading, and I'm going, so why did we uplift? I say we because I'm employed by them. Why did we uplift in that particular case? Whānau become angry with the system rather than try and work with the system, and that's the changes that are happening. I also refer to the legislative acts and everything that have been brought in. You may say whānau, but you actually don't understand the concept of whānau. And another kaimahi. I'm talking hapu. Iwi have to come up with a model that is going to look after our pepe tamariki. That model needs to sit next to government, not underneath it, where we always seem to sit, and it needs the funding for that also. And I emphasise it needs the funding for that also. Kaimahi, of course, also, Kōrero also spoke about racism. Racism was, and they discussed the racism barriers for whānau. I mostly work with Māori. It's hardcore racism here and poverty. The community level for our people is very scary because the racism out there is rampant, which means that you might get out of the whānau level violence. However, your struggle to get employment has just quadrupled. Employment, acceptance, just walking down the street without drama, things like that. They also noted how much systemic racism affects all Māori. Even if I took it out of that family violence sphere as such, community of violence affects all of us. An example, a school around here just had interviews going for a principal. There were 4 Māori candidates who were put forward for this job. There was a yes pile, a no pile, and a maybe pile. Of course, all of the Māori candidates straight in the no pile for no reason. Also wanted to allude to deficit thinking because, again, this just is so persistent. Deficit approaches were described by one kai kōrero as if we're only defining a person through the problems that they have. Well, that highlights it's a deficit model. So negative statistics, of course, have become a way of framing violence as a Māori problem rather than a social and colonial problem created over generations of impacts. Deficit approaches assume that dominant Pākehā culture and societal norms and practices are the only norms and standard. So if whānau violence and interventions continue to be delivered from a Pākehā conceptual and practice framework, that isolates, criminalises and pathologises Māori individuals. Nothing will change. And that comes from the report. I spoke about hegemony earlier, and I just wanted to note that those that we interviewed were very aware and spoke a lot about internalized colonization, about hegemony. So I'm going to say it's colonization to a T. I think about this all the time. Colonization that time, for Māori, they took on the oppressive values and beliefs. We just had to take that on board. That's how you do. That's how you manage. You take control. You put pressure on, you know, domineering, all that kind of stuff comes through. So we had to take on that behavior. And it's no different even now. It's still here. And that colonization, as we take those that have been colonized on, it takes on the values and beliefs of the other. And we become violent in that sense. And that cycle just continues oppressing. So we do it to our own whānau. Poverty, of course, is a huge topic to cover. I'm not going to go into the statistics. We're all familiar with how appalling they are. But what I did want to say was that disasters and pandemics further entrench poverty for the vulnerable generally, but for Māori and Pacifica populations in particular. But these are a couple of quotes from our kaikoura. I do feel like probably first and foremost, their basic needs to be met. They need to have an income that enables them to provide for their families, or that then needs to be adequate resources, first and foremost. This is another quote. The government needs to come down to grassroots. They need to come in and work with the whānau, see where we're at, see where the community services are at. Actually go in and get a feel of it. Don't just sit behind the desk and think everything. Go out and engage. It is poverty. It's education, it's health, it's all of those. If they can come down and see us at grassroots, then nothing at government level will be missed. There would be no, oh, yep, can you do, to make each level the same level, rather than them sitting above us. Many of our kaikoura also referred to the harms of alcohol, that alcohol causes, that it's continuous, very and pervasive. So through colonisation, alcohol was introduced to our people. They spoke about the historical aspects of it. Through colonisation, alcohol was introduced to our people, and a lot of horrible things happened as a result. And through that, I believe hurt people were then hurting their own whānau. I've deliberately put a lot of quotes in here because I really want the voices of the people we interviewed to really be present as I'm talking about this, rather than just talk about the theoretical abstract underpinnings of how these things play out. Here's another person. My cousin talked about how she grew up and she never really saw violence in her life until alcohol was introduced to the pā. And so that makes me think that when you introduce something that's new and different, that then potentially disrupts something. And there were many examples given of how alcohol was used as a deliberate tool in early colonisation, and very much for dispossession of Māori. And of course, in this research, we heard vastly increased references to methamphetamine and its grave impacts upon whānau. Again, this is an area I can't do huge justice to, but I did want to pull out a couple of quotes to illustrate how the impacts have been. Alcoholism during those times played a major role in violence among our marae. Not really what we see now. We see P all the way through. P is another dimension that creates the worst of the worst tragic murders from our people, with our women, with our children. And often we're reading headlines in papers, we're reading stories that are happening in papers around violence, and the scale and the levels of it is absolutely incredible. And while it's often not said, there's often peers often behind the scenes. Addiction is addiction. Today, methamphetamine is the biggest, most wanted, most addictive drug around in the whole of the world. And the things that meth brings with it is definitely violence, is corruption all around. Another aspect of historical trauma that people talked about was silencing, silence and visibility, the cloaks of silence. Historical trauma is also about a direct contributor to the reality of being silenced and not being able to voice the impact of violence. So, and I've just given some examples here that people spoke about. If you have intergenerational examples of not being heard, why would you speak up? If you're in fear of children being removed, why would you speak up? If you're in fear of punishment type approaches rather than help, why would you speak up? If you've not been believed in the past or now, why would you speak up? So there's a lot of layers to the ways in which whānau can be silenced. Kaimahi spoke about having to be clear to hold the respect of whānau and understand the complexity of cause and current issues, to educate and to also call out what is not tika and pono. So these are the last two slides I have. People also talked about healing from intergenerational trauma, and I haven't gone a lot into that, but we can talk about that later. When we're talking about modern day violence, that is actually not who we are as a people. That is why as a people, I believe we will heal from this as we revitalise our practices and revitalise our mātauranga. That will be the healing thing. What that is, the revitalisation of our culture and our reo, is reimplanting who we are, who we were. As they took it away, what we are now doing is the process, is reimplanting that into our people. And as we replant that within our people, it will extract the kino that Pākehā gave and put upon us as Māori, as iwi. And I think the last thing to talk about is just the importance, the enduring importance of self-determination and te tiriti in everything. And when we're talking about the state, of course, we have to talk about te tiriti in particular, and the way in which the state has been set up and the parameters in which the state operates. So there's a much more fundamental level that we have to address when it comes to addressing violence. We've got to address a number of layers simultaneously. So this is my last quote. And I'm sorry for the wordiness of this, but it really does address what needs to be said. And it's, as I say, it's said by one of the people that we interviewed. There is a whakapapa to violence, and it takes us all the way back to racism and classism and sexism and all of those isms. But actually, we are not going to address it unless we can get back to a constitutional frame in this country that actually recognises the mana of tangata tiriti and tangata whenua. Until we get to that, I don't think we're going to be able to create spaces where we have fully realised expression of what it is to be Māori in our own whenua. I just don't think it's possible. In the meantime, in this current completely racist, dysfunctional structure that we're operating in, I think the role of Iwi and Māori organisations is to hold space for tikanga Māori and te reo Māori and te ao Māori and Māori people, to hold space in a way that recognises the inherent mana of Māori people because of our whakapapa, and to accept us in our brokenness and our disconnectedness and our pain and all of the other things that we bring, and actually love us anyway, and fight for those spaces and hold them so that healing is possible. Nobody is signing up for a prescription for this stuff. It's all about doing the work for ourselves. So I do think it's about holding space for our people to come to that healing on our own terms, and all things going well, to be reconnected to the essence of ourselves as Māori. I think for as long as we are disconnected from that or lost to it, anything that we do is a bit of a band-aid, really. Kia ora. And that's me. I'll hand it back to you, Henirangi. Kia ora.
O ngā mihi nui kia koe e te whaia. I worry about, is it okay if I call you whaia? I might have to call you tuakana because we're probably, you know. Kia te anō, we have a couple of, or a number of questions coming through. One of our participants has said, kia ora, Cherryl, can you please talk more about how whānau experience systemic violence of racism, and how this research also connects to your racism survey?
So systemic, so it's important to understand, I guess, all the different systems that exist when it comes to the state and the different types of systems that exist. And we looked at a number of systems. The survey covers quite a bit in terms of what our whānau have experienced from the different public sectors. So you've got, responses around kind of both everyday activities, everyday impacts, as well as the broader impacts.
Right. Speaking about those broader impacts, another of our participants have said, when you talk about systems being violent on whānau, do you feel or see that education is a system that continues that violence on our tamariki?
I think we have to look at where and how. I think, racism exists also in all of the systems. That's the reality. All of the systems that we currently have, it exists, whether we like it or not. And we have to look into schools. We have to look into all of these different places and examine, how does racism play out across schools? How does it impact on our tauira? What are the ways in which and unravel it? And, there's lots of small battles I see happening around that. Everyday things that whānau do to try to address what happens for their tamariki, their mokopuna, in that space. But it's ongoing and continues. So, there's lots of examples I could give of that. And we just have to look at things like the rates of exclusions across schools. Lots of data there too.
Aye. Just acknowledging Marama Davidson has commented in the Q&A as well, and says that these presentations are invaluable, and we've noted that these are being recorded and will be shared as a resource for our whānau. So tēnei te mihi kia koe e Marama. He pātai anō tēnei. In responding to the genealogy of violence, how do we create different genealogies for the future? What steps do whānau need to take to change their futures?
I think what's really important is, I think, Karina Walter's works really does match up with what we're doing, which is that as whānau, we do get together, we do talk about what's happening for us as a people. We do run wānanga, we are looking at whakapapa, we are having conversations around what's happened to us as whānau and hapu. And I think that's really important, and whether they're run as wānanga, whakapapa wānanga, whether those are run as, and there's lots of different ways in which we're having those. I think it's also important to, and that's really key, I think, is us re-strengthening ourselves and providing that reinstituting that collective strength, because a lot happens around individualization and a lot of pressure goes on us all the time to become fragmented as generations, fragmented across generations. So we have just the act, I think, of coming back together as whānau, strengthening ourselves solidly as whānau. That's an act of resistance. That's an act of challenge. And so we start there. There are hard conversations we do need to have across all whānau. And, you know, there are conversations, violence, for example, is one hard conversation. The impact of addictions might be, and it's not unique to any whānau. When I talk about whānau, I don't mean mum, dad, and, you know, grandparents, just grandparents, children, just one line. I mean the wide network of what whānau actually is. You know, and for me, that's a very wide net. And I think we really have to have some really good conversations with each other around how we see what whānau is, because again, our idea of what whānau is getting narrowed all the time. And we have to counter that narrative and open it right up to around what whānau really is. It's very wide. So I'm lucky in my generation because I was brought up that whānau actually extended across Iwi. And it extended into, we were told to call a lot of people auntie and uncle, and I've only sort of in kind of the last decade probably unravelled properly what those whakapapa connections were. So once we start to unravel our own whakapapa connections, that opens up a world of what whānau is. But as I say, when I grew up, those connections were whānau, even if I did not understand that whakapapa link. And it was a very broad reach. So understanding that, I think, also needs to be, you know, we really need to kind of dig deep around what whānau is. I think we're narrowing it down. The pressures are on us to narrow it down all the time, to individualise it and narrow it.
Nai, tēnā koe. We have a couple of comments / pātai around storytelling, so I'll ask both of them at the same time. The first is, kia ora rā mō te puna kōrero nei, he pātai, you mentioned restorying or storytelling. Can you explain more on that? And a second one is, kia ora whai Cherryl, ngā mihi nui kia mō tō kōrero me tō mahi katoa i te kaupapa nei ia tau, ngā mihi mō tō tautoko, kia rātou me ngā mahi rangahau mā te atawhai o te ao, he pātai tāku. This is from Hayley, Marama Kavino. You mentioned the importance of understanding the whakapapa of violence and how this mahi can or should be done at a whānau and hapu level. I'm wondering if you can speak to how we do that work and maybe the importance of story, the stories we tell about it.
I think that's why I wanted to sort of emphasise the importance of how wide whānau is, that it might not be. Sometimes within whānau we cannot always, for various reasons, we cannot necessarily link to our immediate whānau. So we link to, but we are able to link to whānau who understand where we're at in our particular time in life and where things are at for us. So it seems to me that we have to, you know, it's really important for us to find, there's lots of different healing pathways. It's a very complex area to kind of look at, but the importance is to understand where people are at in their particular journey in order to understand what healing pathway they need to take. And that's why I emphasize the broadness of whānau, that where we find, we have to find whānau sometimes in order to understand exactly what where we're at. And I think I'll give an example of that where, say, I'm raising a mokopuna who has FASD. For me, part of my whānau is actually other whānau who have tamariki mokopuna with FASD. The connections and closeness of us to each other is really important. And it helps us to be strong enough to inform the rest of our whānau around, and we have to inform them because we're in the unique position of understanding something which they don't necessarily understand.
Ai. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe e poipoi ana I tō mokopuna, and I just had to Google FASD.
Sorry.
So just making sure I'm clarifying, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders is what it's coming up in Google. Is that the tika ana? So you did talk about some of those kawenga that our whānau sometimes experience with meth and alcohol and things like that. We also had pātai earlier today about kaupapa whaikaha and other pathways that are also experiencing that intersectionality that Leonie talked about in those experiences. As a kuia raising her mokopuna, how do you see your learnings and your teaching from your generation benefiting where other young, parents who are young and may not have had those teachings in their kite to support them? How does it help you? And what are the rongoa for those who don't have that in their kite?
So that seemed like about 3 questions to me.
Sorry.
You simplify or?
Yeah, just talking about your raising a mokopuna.
Yeah.
We're talking about intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
What the teachings that you have from your generation. You said, I'm fortunate because I was raised in a generation where whānau had a broad base.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the other things in your kite that help you raising your mokopuna that may not be in other people's kite?
Yeah, I do feel privileged to be in the generation that I'm in because I do feel like I was able to have queer, particularly around me, whose ways of doing things and being was really important in my learning, and very much a groundedness to them that you just take for granted until it's not there. So very strong connections, for example, to the taiao and all of the benefits that come from the taiao. Very strong connections to our ways of rongoa. So drawing rongoa from rākau, rongoa rākau, but also things like rāranga, all of those types of activities which are so, which are a complete rongoa in and of themselves. So that's been really awesome to have had that as, I guess, direct experience. I think that, those teachings to us around ways of being are so important for me. I've always been interested that my grandmother never actually, she wasn't a you didn't ask her why questions. You never asked her why questions. You just had to observe and follow. She did not explain, but she always parked you up beside her when she was doing something. And so you learnt very much through your hands, as opposed through, and the feel of things. And so, I find both with, in Marakai and also with things like rāranga, I can leave them for years, but when I pick them back up, it's actually the experience, the actual connection is reactivated. It's not a head thing, if you know what I mean. I just pick it up and there's a more direct knowing from the actual rāranga, from the harakeke, or from the soil, or from whatever I'm working on. And I feel so grateful for having had that. I think that often today we teach so much through question and answer and why and how, that the kind of experiential love and passion and feeling of deep connectedness is not necessarily there, or people have to really work to reclaim that. And yeah, they have to work hard to reclaim it.
Right. Just by participating in this webinar, many of those who are online with us, who are practitioners, are probably finding rongoa for their souls and just being fed rather than being the one feeding all the time. But so I acknowledge everyone who is listening, and also with the pārtai. We have a pārtai here from an anonymous participant. Kia ora, Cherryl. What is the answer to addressing white saviorism and stemming the tide of uplift of our tamariki rangatahi mokopuna by OT?
Oh, it's so huge. But look, I don't believe the state the state should not be involved in that end of. So, what people said to us in the research was clearly that decisions around our tamariki need to be with us. They need to be with us and our people. Having said that, there is the resourcing there available for us to be able to actually pick up and run with it. And that's the other end of it, is that we're starved for the resourcing to be able to do that. I've seen various attempts around the country for iwi, for example, to try and pick up that area into a greater, and I'm not quite sure, I'm not in the know enough around how well they are doing, but I've also seen strong criticisms around the underfunding and under-resourcing of that area to enable us to be able to do it. I know there's a lot of will from our people, but the follow-up is the critical aspect of it.
Tēnā koe. Pārtai around organisations as well from Darren Holton. Kia ora, Cherryl. Big mihi to you and the teachings you shared at Whanganui Polytech whilst I was there. I continue to share the tauranga that I learned and incorporate in my mahi. Those state organisations, WINS or rangatamariki, the kōrero shared is exactly what is needed in those spaces. Is that an opportunity?
I think, I know from, and you'll see in some of the presentation that there are quotes there from workers inside of Tamariki. Our Māori people, I shouldn't say all, but most of them actually know what is required in there. And many go in, I think, in good faith, wanting to see those changes and wanting to but it's kind of a two-sided, the white saviorism thing is so deeply embedded that it requires, it doesn't underpin so much. It needs to be, and that won't happen overnight. At most, we will get respect. in the interim, it underpins the lack of trust, but it also holds resources in one space and does not allow that resourcing to come out to where it needs to go to. I heard Leonie's comment earlier around the need to kind of relinquish that resourcing from the state, that it should be 50-50, that we should be where we're going. And but the reality is, and Linda talked earlier around things like the resourcing is controlled by what they consider to be a valid evidence base for releasing funding. That gets controlled by the fact of what they consider to be a valid evidence base. And much of the training and everything else that rolls out from there. So there are many battlefields that people engage in inside actual agencies themselves. And our people are kind of fighting these little battles daily, every day, trying to change that system and get things. But there's some bigger issues there. I think in terms of changing the white saviorism, that's a huge issue that involves education, but it involves that it really involves undoing so much, and we don't actually. It's a really good question, I think, because we don't actually. That's not what our goal is. I don't think changing them. Our focus is on ourselves and how we need to get what we need to get in order for our people to flourish and survive. We can do so much education, but we can't change them. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this one here is about education, I suppose, and developing that critical mass and capability. Tēnā koe, Cherryl. This is from an anonymous participant. Do you think that it is important that there be more workforce development about historical and intergenerational trauma? You talk about Karina Walter's work and how valuable that is, and it seems we need more access to that way of thinking about trauma. And are there kupu Māori for that trauma?
Yeah, kia ora. So yes, there are kupu Māori. So, there's the term paturangako obviously is there, but we've got terms like pauritanga. I mean, there's a vast field of te reo Māori kupu, I think, that can be, and then there's a lot of kōrero too that can be analysed from our own stories, the separation of rangi and papa, various kōrero, which those pūrākau, which I know groups are already analysing those, feeding into how ways that we can think about these things and the ways we can develop our own frameworks for guiding us. So that work's ongoing. It's awesome. It's building all the time. I think the other thing too is that we need to, I've forgotten the second part of the question. What's the second part of the question?
Let me just check. It was about Karina Walter's work and how valuable it is, and we need, to access the way of thinking about trauma. Are there kupu Māori for the trauma?
I think that, so I think the other thing too is we are developing again. I think Jenny Lee Morgan's work is really important for thinking about pūrākau and for thinking about the ways in which pūrākau can can be used and how they can be, and it's important for us and I think the notion of both storing and restoring are really important, and that we need to understand what those processes, and to develop processes that help us with that. But you're right, currently there is nothing that actually helps us to do that. Nothing that helps us get together and actually start doing that. And yet it's a really invaluable healing pathway for us to undertake. But zilch, I can't see anything around that. Maybe there's a wee bit coming out of that's being generated out of, things like maybe the hapu mama program and others. But, it really needs, I think, consistent resourcing to be able to come out and enable all of us to do it.
Right. A related pātai from Kim McBree, tēnā koe, o tira tēnā koutou I ngā kaimahi katoa I tēnei mahi whakahirahira. There is so much work to be done and so many whānau are working hard. But like you've been saying, the system is set up to hold us back. Are there structures or mahi that iwi could be setting up or demanding resources for to support community-based work? How do we advance that mahi?
I think one thing with iwi is I think they're kind of I think there's a lot of expectation on iwi structures and what they have been set up to do and what they are capable of doing. So most people say, I do this sometimes and it's not great. I will often say iwi when what I'm meaning is the runanga. Okay, the runanga, not iwi. So I think we do have to differentiate between the entities that have been established for us under treaty settlements that are set up to manage our commercial assets, to manage our commercial arms, and also that develop, ways of helping our people. So we have to differentiate between that and iwi. I think there's kind of two things happening here. So I think and so what that means is that we have to think about what is it that, and when people ask questions like that, what they're meaning is, how can our runangas drive whatever it is that we are wanting to set up? In other words, why can't runanga drive new models and new ways of working? My observations is currently they are working really hard, responding to in every area you can name, pretty much, responding to what the Crown is currently doing. They are responding to under-resourcing. They are responding to opportunities that arise. They are delivering in certain areas because that is where the door has come slightly ajar in that particular area. So they are doing, that they are working in that space. But I think it's, I think sometimes we put a lot of expectation on what they can actually do. My observations is they are working hard, and there's a lot of people working hard in that space. But is that where the creation of new things will emerge, new frameworks, structures? Actually, new frameworks and structures, often they don't have the time for actually even contemplating the new. They're so busy responding to the protection of our whenua, to the protection of our people, and trying to maximize the opportunity, the small opportunity, I have to say, that they've been given. I kind of want to set that out, but I also think from what I'm seeing happening in research, rangahau is so critical, because rangahau is where we do get the space to think about and to go out and talk to people and to spend the time looking at the data, looking at contemplating ways that we could do things differently. We get time to have just the most amazing conversations with the most amazing people across the whole country, and to try to put together new ways of doing things. And it seems in that space we've got the opportunity to develop frameworks, but those frameworks also need to suit however we're, how we're operating in our different areas across our different regions, because we are very clear that, what we need to also work from the ground up within our communities.
Right. Just thank you, Whaia. Darren Holton has just a comment here. For Cherryl, I'm one of them that is working in Oranga Tamariki, doing my bit as well. I never thought I would work there until my darling told me to get in there and support our whānau, including non-Māori, because they feel and experience violence from the state. So tēnei te mihi ki a koe, me te rā kōrero. Paora Moyle has a part-time. Kia ora, Cherryl. How do we counter the growing imposter kaupapa Māori out there? Is this not also a form of violence?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, the term imposter tikanga, which I think Tamati Kruger's report, that's where it first came up. We've really got some work to do around decolonising in that space. So, I haven't talked about decolonisation, but that's a critical area. But just to call what Paula said there.
Right. And so for those who are online who may be asking, what does it mean? What does imposter kaupapa Māori actually mean?
So imposter tikanga is things like, we saw some court cases not that long ago, and I don't know if they're still happening, but where sort of a claim would be made that it was tikanga, and this was in courts, that tikanga Māori said it was okay to beat your wife. So that's a classic example of imposter tikanga. Of course, it goes to all sorts of levels, but that's where, we've got a lot of work to be decolonising, not just decolonising, and really thinking through our own reo and our own kōrero. Decolonising, the work that Ani Makairi has done around decolonising, the ways in which our stories have been told through a patriarchal lens. All of that work that's been done, and there's some really good mahi out there. That to me is, that addresses, in my mind, imposter tikanga. So again, that's ongoing work, really important.
You mentioned, we were talking earlier, and you said, our focus is on our people, not necessarily on institutions and, e mihi ana ki e rā kōrero. But our next part is actually about what strategies exist to enable people of Aotearoa to understand colonisation on a granular and personal basis and its relationship to violence.
I think, colonisation is violence. It's our difficulty is I think we've been taught it as if it was a benign, neutral process that happened. And it's only been, I was at university in the doing my master's back in the 1990s. And at that time, the word colonisation was not used in universities. It was because it was considered a dangerous word. And I remember putting the title Colonisation and Iwi Development on my master's thesis, and that was a first. That was in the 1990s. So that discussion of colonisation, so we've had many, many, many years of colonisation, telling us that it's, and telling everyone else in this country that it was a benign process. And people were not allowed to talk about it as a dangerous process, as a harmful process. And I think one of the things I've really appreciated about these recent decades of research has been that we've been able to uncover the layers of trauma, the layers of pain that actually impacted on colonisation, that colonisation caused. Now, when it comes to us telling it, that means that there's a lot of networks that hold that benign kind of idea of colonisation in place, and we have to unravel those layers. Now, again, it's an area that a lot of us are doing a lot of work in, whether we're trying to write our own stories within hapu and iwi, whether we're trying to, we've got changes happening in the curriculum at the moment, and everyone's really worried about, well, whose histories are going to be taught. If we're talking about the history of Māori and colonisation, who is going to be talking those histories? And our voices have been silenced for so long that we also have to do the work to create the stories to be able to counter those benign narratives, because their narratives, there's their narratives, and then there's our having had 180 years of suppressed kōrero, which means we still have to do the work to create those narratives and to get those narratives out there more clearly. And those there's battles being waged over that everywhere. You'll find local councils, for example, how we're described in local councils, the namings of different sites, battling over names. We can be, here in Whanganui, how long did people battle over the H in Whanganui for the council to put the H in Whanganui? That took many, many years. So that, there is that upsurge. But again, it's an area that needs resourcing, that we can't write those histories, we can't get our own stories out there if we're not resourced to be able to spend the time to piece back the stories together and talk them back. Meantime, Pākehā histories are still dominating around, in many of our regions.
Right. Well, there are two questions that are around strategies for whānau. The first question is asking, how do we achieve reconnecting to one another and being visible to each other? And I think you're answering that by in some of the responses to other pātai. But yeah, there's another pātai around internalized racism, and how can individuals or whānau who may not have the benefit of feeling comfortable in their own Māori skin, having whānau that have, I suppose, leaders in the areas that they see as valuable. How do we deal with that internalized racism and reconnect with whānau in a positive way?
I think it's really important to have, I used to find with students all the time, Māori students all the time, they could often feel quite insecure about their own identities as Māori. And a lot of that, I think, is around the recognition of the diversity of who we are as Māori as well, that we need to recognise and accept the diversity of who we are. That sometimes we can be guilty of holding up the gold standard Māori looks like this, and then all trying to be that. When in actual fact, we are a very diverse people, and we continue to diversify and to become more diverse. So trying to get us all back into one box and to look the same, talk the same, and feel the same is not going to, it's not really our goal. Our goal is really around understanding that we're all on reconnection pathways. We're all on that. We might be different places on where that is, but we are Māori, and that those are works in progress for everybody. So I think that's my answer.
Fantastic. One last question, and it's a question from me actually. Last night I was speaking with a whanaunga who told me that he married into a whānau with a tamaiti Māori whose Māori parent was no longer on the scene, and they were raised by a non-Māori parent. The Māori parent has been incarcerated for violence, the intimate partner violence, and this whanaunga of mine is a beautiful Māori man, in-law uncle to this tamaiti. We were talking about what are the strategies, how do we, help to reconnect this tamaiti to the ukaipo, to draw on other examples where his primary relationship to whakapapa Māori may not be his parent. Do you see examples, positive examples of that happening intentionally across the motu, and which should we be drawing our whakapapa to, who are doing it well?
I think, yes, I do. I see, just in a personal sense, I know a number of people who have had to make that journey themselves to reconnect, and that has been, and that can be a very long process. I think it's important to, that's incredibly common. It's incredibly common, and I think it's important to look at work like the Whāngai project that's happening, that's Helen Potter and others from Raukawa have been part of. That's a whole body of work around exactly that, which is, and then there's other research which has been done on, particularly for those Māori who were uplifted or who have gone into systems and then lost, for whatever reason, lost connection to whakapapa. So that's a really big area, which I think, as I say, there's been some really good projects now which have been done around that. So in the situations that I know of, the personal situations that I know of, it has been, those journeys can be fraught with expectation and hope and disappointment. And each journey has looked very different depending on who and how that journey happens. But we know it's important. And we also know that it's important to be thinking about not only from the individual person exploring that reconnection, but also from our hapu and iwi perspectives around how do we reconnect. And there's layers, we know, to that reconnection. It's not a simple matter of just being brought back to the marae and going through a pōhiri. It's then about the process that ensues after that, and how those connections become more meaningful connections and are sustained over time.
Well, I hope when the research is released in December, I believe, that those of us who have participated today in this webinar, but also in earlier today and next week and the week after, that we can draw on those voices, the rich quotes that you shared today by Cherryl. You could hear the voices of the people that you listened to and the fidelity that you gave to those voices, just acknowledging that sometimes as researchers, that's not always the way. So I just thank you very, very much to you and the team of He Waka Eke Noa in the way that you have co-produced this mahi today. We ko mutu te wā kia tāua whaia, and I hope that you get a chance to have a cup of tea after this, because you've shared a lot today. Thank you for everything that you've done. And as the people who ask the questions, ia tau, kei reira koe, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Kia anō rā I te whānau e whakarongo mai ana. We have 6 more webinars that are happening, 3 next Friday, and then the following Friday as well. We will hear from Rihi Te Nana on Friday morning, next Friday morning, about tikanga and tauranga Māori cultural understandings and healing. Click onto the same link that you registered for this one to come to those as well. If you have further questions that you didn't get to ask via Cherryl in this session, we welcome those pātai to you. So go to the invitation to this webinar, and please do email us. We want to hear from you. If this kaupapa has brought stuff up for you, we ask you to go to to reach out to those who are around you and be that papa tuanuku and ranginui. And right now I'm in Tamaki Makaurau, and Tawhiri Mātea is blowing the leaves off the trees at the moment. Go and find those spaces that are rongoa for you, and those natural spaces. We look after you, we think of you, and we thank you for the mahi that you do and the person that you are today. Thanking again to Tama Wahine o Taranaki for the opportunity to participate in this webinar, and we wish everybody a safe weekend this weekend. So kia whakakapi tō tātou hui, hikitia ngā taumaha, hāpaitia ngā kaupapa kei runga I tēnā o tātou. I roto I te ngākau maaki, I roto I te mauri tū, I te mauri ora, kia pūmau te oranga o te whānau ki roto I a tātou katoa. Ko tā koe whakaro nei, he manawa ora ki te iwi, mo ake tonu. Tū mai rā tātou, hei whānau. He whānau whakakotahi ai I runga I te kaupapa o te aroha. E rongo. Whakairi ake I nei whakaro, kia tīna, kia maua, mauri ora e te whānau. Tēnā tātou.